Chapter 2. Taken by surprise, the burglars were at a disadvantage. Frank and Joe knocked them to the floor and sat on their backs.
What's going on?"
one mumbled. The men were strong, and with great heaves they tried to shake off the boys, and Frank and Joe pressed down hard. "Who are you?" Frank demanded. No answer. Then suddenly the man Joe was holding rolled over and tried to sit up. Joe kept him down, and the two, locked in vice-like grip, twisted to and fro across the floor. Frank, meanwhile, had found his deep-voiced opponent, a kicker, who viciously jabbed his heels into the boy's back. Angry, Frank sent two swift blows which grazed the man's chin. The other two fighters bumped into them. In the mix-up, the burglars were able to throw off their attackers and scramble to their feet, and the four began to exchange punches.
"Finish off these guys,"
the nasally voiced man rasped. For several seconds it looked as if they would. Their blows were swift and well aimed. Then both men, breathing heavily, relaxed their guard. In a flash, Frank and Joe delivered stinging uppercuts to their opponent's jaw. The burglars fell to the floor with thuds that shook the house, and then they lay quiet. The boys grinned at each other, and Joe said, "Knocked out." Frank nodded. We must notify the police to get out here before these men come to." "Oh, we can wait," Joe answered. "They'll sleep at least for half an hour. We better find that invention first." "Good idea." Though bruised and weary, the boys eagerly searched the side of the knee hole where Frank thought he had found a clue. There was a slight bulge in the wood. After pressing it in several directions, a panel began to slide counterclockwise, and then there was a click. Just then one of the burglars groaned. The Hardys tensed. Was the man coming to? Joe leaned forward, beamed his flashlight on the two figures, and both were still unconscious. Meanwhile, Frank had lifted out the panel. The space behind it contained a small metal box, and written on the side of the box was, "Property of Malkin Wright, valuable, reward for return." "I found it!" Frank exclaimed. "Well, let's get going then," Frank urged. "Okay," Frank agreed. "You'll find a phone in the lower hallway. Call the police while I slip this panel back. Take the box with you." In a moment, Joe was dialing headquarters, and without giving his name, he said, "Come to Malkin Wright's house at once. There's burglars in it." And then he hung up. Frank joined him, and the boys dashed out of the rear door. They took a circuitous route to their convertible to avoid being questioned by the police. At a cross street, they saw a police car apparently speeding to the inventor's house. "Where do you suppose the burglar's car is?" Joe asked. "You'd think they've had a lookout." "Maybe it's cruising," Frank suggested. The boys hopped into their convertible. As an extra precaution against a hold-up and possible loss of Mr. Wright's invention, they locked themselves inside. "Boy, a lot can sure happen in an hour," Joe said, looking at the car clock. He reached over and turned on their two-way radio to police headquarters. "I wonder if there's been any news yet from the Wright house." The boys were just in time to pick up a broadcast, and officer saying, "Send the ambulance to Wright's house." "Ambulance?" Frank echoed. "Joe, we didn't hit him that hard. Did we?" The policeman went on. "These guys, they aren't bad off. They sure got knocked out, though. It looks like a gang feud. The men who cowed 'em might have done the stealing." Frank and Joe chuckled. "Well, someday we'll have to tell Chief Collig. But right now," Frank said. He stopped speaking as a loud crack of static burst from the radio, and a vivid flash of lightning made the night turn to day momentarily. A long roll of thunder followed. "Gee, looks like we're in for a bad storm," Joe commented, and then Frank put on speed. A few minutes later, the car was parked in the Hardys' garage. They mounted the steps of the back porch when the storm broke. Quickly, Frank inserted his key into the kitchen door and turned the knob. And at once the burglar alarm rang loudly, and all the first floor lights went on. Joe chuckled. That'll sure bring Mother and Aunt Gertrude down in a hurry. He flicked off the alarm. And bring the police, too, Frank added. He picked up the kitchen phone and dialed headquarters. This is Frank Hardy. Our alarm went off by accident. Just forget about it. Okay. You sure everything's all right? The desk sergeant asked. Yeah, thank you. Have a good night. By this time, the two women had appeared, and Miss Hardy said, I didn't know the alarm was turned on.
Well, I did, Aunt Gertrude spoke up. I wanted to make sure to wake up to see how the boys made out. They must be starved. I'll fix some cocoa and cut a couple slices of cake while you tell. Frank, look at your clothes. Your jacket's torn, and you, Joe. Where'd you get that lump on your forehead? And your faces, the two of you, look like you've been rolling around in the dirt.
We have, Joe grinned. We had us a big old fight, but we saved this. He pulled the box from his pocket. As the boys related their adventure, crash and thunder lent a booming orchestration to the story.
Well, this is the worst storm we've had in years, Miss Hardy remarked. I'm glad you boys didn't have to be out in it.
When Frank and Joe finished eating, she added,
Now, you must be getting off to sleep.
But first, I'd like to open Mr. Wright's box and see what we're supposed to be guarding so carefully, Frank said. Everyone watched excitingly as Joe unwrapped the package. Inside was a small transistor radio.
Is that all? Aunt Gertrude burst out. You risked your lives to get that.
The boys were puzzled. Surely their father hadn't made such a request if this invention hadn't been unusually valuable. Well, let's turn it on, Frank suggested. Joe clicked the switch. A man was speaking in Spanish from Madrid, Spain, and announcing the start of a newscast, and his voice was very clear. Frank grabbed his brother's arm. Do you hear that? He cried. The receiver's not picking up one bit of static. You're right, Joe agreed. It must be designed to work on some high-frequency bands or something. But how can we be reaching a broadcast direct from Madrid? That Spanish station must be transmitting by shortwave, yet we're hearing it loud and clear. This is amazing. Joe gazed at the miniature radio with great interest. I'll bet there's a lot more to Mr. Wright's invention than just to be able to hear the overseas station without static, he observed. After all, why is he so anxious to keep it a secret? Just then, there was a loud knock on the back door, and a voice from outside said, Let me in. I'm a ham. I have a message for you. End of chapter 2.